Rain hammered against the metal walls of the cargo terminal like angry fists demanding entry, each drop creating a symphony of chaos that Ben Carter had grown accustomed to during his late-night maintenance rounds through the sprawling New Chicago. Interstellar Hub, the year 2157, had brought humanity closer to the stars than ever before, with massive freight ships arriving daily from distant worlds, their cargo holds filled with exotic goods and alien passengers seeking new lives among the colonies that now dotted the galaxy like scattered diamonds. Ben adjusted his worn tool belt and checked the time on his wrist display. Nearly midnight, which meant most of the day shift workers had long since retreated to their warm homes, while he continued his solitary patrol through the maze of warehouses and loading docks that kept the hub functioning. Lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating the towering structures of New Chicago's skyline for brief moments before plunging everything back into darkness, leaving only the dim amber glow of emergency lighting to guide his path as he made his way toward the waste disposal area behind Terminal 7. The sound that stopped him wasn't thunder or machinery, or even the constant patter of rain against metal. It was something softer, more desperate, like fabric rustling combined with the quiet whimper of someone trying very hard not to make noise. Ben paused beside a stack of empty cargo containers, straining his ears to locate the source of the disturbance, wondering if perhaps a stray animal had wandered into the restricted area looking for shelter from the storm. Another sound reached him, this time unmistakably organic, the soft scraping of hands digging through refuse, followed by what could only be described as a relieved sigh when something edible was apparently discovered, moving carefully around the corner of the nearest building. Ben peered into the shadows cast by the towering dumpsters that served the hub's various food service facilities, expecting to see perhaps a homeless person or wayward maintenance android. What he found instead made him question whether the long hours and poor lighting had finally affected his sanity. A small figure crouched beside an overturned container, tiny hands sifting through discarded food packages with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The child, for that's what it clearly was, despite appearances that defied easy classification, possessed skin that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly blue-silver hue even in the dim light, while large violet eyes dominated a face that appeared almost fragile in its delicate bone structure. Ben remained frozen in place, watching as the young being carefully examined each piece of salvaged food, discarding items that had spoiled while tucking others into what appeared to be makeshift pouches sewn into tattered clothing that might once have been fine fabric. The girl, he somehow knew instinctively that she was female despite the obvious species differences, moved with a quiet grace that spoke of desperation tempered by dignity, never grabbing frantically or making unnecessary noise that might attract unwanted attention. When she suddenly looked up and their eyes met across the rain-soaked space between them, Ben felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since his younger sister had been small enough to need his help. Instead of fleeing as he expected, the alien child remained perfectly still, her violet gaze studying him with an intelligence that seemed far older than her, apparent age as though she were weighing his intentions and finding them somehow acceptable. "Please don't call security," she whispered in accented but clearly understandable galactic standard, her voice carrying musical notes that human vocal cords could never produce. "I mean no harm to anyone. I only need food." Ben found himself stepping forward almost without conscious thought, his maintenance instincts overriding any concerns about protocol or regulations that might govern interaction with unauthorized aliens on Earth facilities. "How long have you been out here?" he asked softly, crouching down to bring himself closer to her eye level while maintaining enough distance to avoid seeming threatening. "Many days," she replied, clutching a partially eaten protein bar against her chest like a precious treasure. "I came here on trading ships hiding in cargo holds when they docked, trying to find somewhere safe." The rain continued to fall around them, creating a curtain of privacy that felt almost intentional, as though the universe itself were providing cover for this unlikely meeting between species. Ben studied the child more carefully, noting details that spoke of recent hardship. The way her clothes hung loose on her small frame, the careful manner in which she hoarded even small scraps of food, the dark circles beneath those remarkable eyes that suggested, "Many sleepless nights, what's your name?" he asked, pulling off his waterproof jacket and offering it to her without thinking about the gesture. "Lyra," she replied, accepting the jacket with a grateful nod and wrapping it around her shoulders like a protective cocoon. "Thank you for your kindness. Most humans I've encountered were not so generous." Something in her tone suggested experiences he didn't want to imagine, encounters that had taught her caution and shaped her into someone far too young to be alone. "In such circumstances, I'm Ben," he said, making a decision that would later prove to change both their destinies. "Listen, I can't leave you out here in this weather. There's a storage room in my section that stays warm, and I've got access to the commissary." Lyra's eyes widened with what he hoped was relief rather than fear, her small hands tightening their grip on his jacket as she considered his offer. "You would do this for me? Even though I am not of your species and have no way to repay such generosity," Ben smiled, remembering his sister at that age and how she'd looked at him with similar trust when their parents had worked late shifts at the factory. "Sometimes helping someone doesn't require reasons beyond the simple fact that they need help," he said, standing and extending his hand toward her. "Besides, everyone deserves a warm place to sleep and enough food to fill their stomach." As Lyra reached up to take his hand, her small fingers surprisingly warm despite the cold rain. Ben noticed something that would later prove significant, a small marking on her wrist that seemed to shift and glow faintly in the dim light. For now, though, he simply helped her to her feet and led her toward the maintenance tunnels that would provide safe passage to the storage room, beginning an unlikely friendship that would soon reveal secrets capable of shaking the foundations of galactic politics. Neither of them could have imagined that this simple act of kindness in a rain-soaked alley would set in motion events that would eventually span star systems and determine the fate of entire civilizations. 3 weeks had passed since Ben first discovered Lyra rummaging through the waste containers behind Terminal 7, and in that time their unusual friendship had developed into something neither of them had expected when they first met in the rain-soaked darkness of New Chicago's cargo district. Each night after his regular maintenance duties, Ben would slip away to the abandoned storage room in Section D7, where Lyra had made herself a surprisingly comfortable home, using salvaged materials and the blankets he'd quietly procured from the hub's emergency supply closets. What had begun as simple charity, bringing food and basic necessities to a desperate alien child, had evolved into something more complex, as Ben began noticing details about his young companion that didn't match her story of being a refugee who'd stowed away on trading vessels. The way Lyra held herself when she thought no one was watching spoke of formal training rather than street survival, her posture naturally straight and graceful in a manner that suggested years of careful instruction, rather than the hunched defensiveness typical of those who lived by scavenging. Her knowledge of galactic politics and interstellar trade routes far exceeded what any ordinary child should possess, regardless of species, and she often made casual references to star systems and diplomatic relationships that even Ben, with his years working at the hub, had never heard discussed in such detail. Most intriguing of all was the small marking on her wrist that he'd first noticed during their initial meeting. What had initially appeared to be a simple tattoo revealed itself under closer observation to be something far more sophisticated. The intricate design seemed to shift and flow like living metal, occasionally glowing with a soft inner light that pulsed in rhythm with Lyra's heartbeat, and Ben had begun to suspect it was some form of advanced biotechnology rather than mere decoration. "Where exactly did you say you came from?" Ben asked. One evening as he watched Lyra carefully arrange the food he'd brought into neat categories, her organizational system displaying the kind of systematic thinking that spoke of formal education. Lyra paused in her sorting, her violet eyes taking on the guarded expression he'd learned to recognize whenever his questions probed too deeply into her background. "The outer colonies," she replied with the same vague answer she'd given before. "My family were merchants who traveled between systems until the troubles began." Ben had learned not to press too hard when she became evasive, but he'd also begun paying closer attention to the news feeds that played constantly in the hub's common areas, searching for information about recent conflicts in the outer territories. What he'd found had raised more questions than it answered. Reports of civil wars and rebel uprisings scattered across dozens of systems, making it difficult to determine which specific conflict might have displaced a family of traveling merchants. The breakthrough came during what should have been a routine evening news broadcast as Ben sat in the commissary during his dinner break, half listening to the standard reports of shipping delays and customs regulations while reviewing his maintenance schedules. In our continuing coverage of the Etherian crisis, the news anchor began, her professional tone carrying undertones of genuine concern. Galactic security forces continue their search for Princess Lyra Lee Solan, last surviving member of the royal family whose assassination 3 months ago sent shockwaves throughout the peaceful Etherian Empire. Ben's attention snapped to the YAR display screen with sudden intensity as images flashed across the broadcast. Artistic renderings of a young alien girl with distinctive silver-blue skin and large violet eyes, features that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the child he'd been sheltering. Princess Lyra Lee, known to her people simply as Lyra, vanished during the attack on the royal palace and is believed to have escaped aboard one of several refugee ships that fled the system following the coup by militant forces calling themselves the Iron Syndicate. The anchor continued. The display showed additional images, the royal palace before its destruction, crowds of refugees fleeing through spaceports, and most significantly, a close-up of what appeared to be a ceremonial tattoo adorning the wrist of every member of the Etherian royal family. Ben's blood turned cold as he recognized the exact same intricate pattern he'd observed on Lyra's wrist, the flowing design that seemed to move and glow with its own inner light. Anyone with information regarding the whereabouts of Princess Lyra Lee is urged to contact Galactic Security immediately, as her safety is considered vital to the stability of the Outer Rim territories. The broadcast concluded before moving on to less earth-shaking topics. Ben sat motionless in the commissary long after the news had moved on to other stories, his mind racing as he tried to process the implications of what he'd just learned. The frightened, malnourished child he'd been feeding and protecting for 3 weeks wasn't simply a refugee from some minor civil conflict. She was royalty, the sole surviving heir to an entire star system, and apparently one of the most wanted individuals. In known space, part of him wanted to dismiss the possibility as coincidence, to tell himself that perhaps many Etherian children possess similar markings and features, but the resemblance was too exact, and the timing too perfect to ignore. When he returned to Section D7 that night, Ben found Lyra sitting cross-legged, on the makeshift bed he'd constructed from shipping foam and emergency blankets, her small hands working with practiced precision to mend a tear in her tattered clothing. Lyra, he began carefully, settling onto a storage crate that served as his usual chair during their evening conversations. I saw something on the news tonight that I think we need to discuss. Her hands stilled immediately, and when she looked up at him, her violet eyes held a mixture of resignation and fear that told him everything he needed to know. You know who I am, she said quietly, not phrasing it as a question, since his expression had already provided the answer. Princess Lyra Lee Solan of the Etherian Empire, Ben replied, watching as she flinched slightly at hearing her full name spoken aloud. The question is, why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth? Lyra set aside her mending and pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that made her look even smaller and more vulnerable than usual. Because every time someone has learned my identity, they have tried to either turn me in for the reward or sell me to the highest bidder, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Iron Syndicate wants me dead because as long as I live, their claim to Etheria Prime remains illegitimate. Ben felt a surge of protective anger at the thought of anyone attempting to harm this remarkable young being, who had already endured so much loss and betrayal. And you thought I might do the same thing? He asked, trying to keep any hint of hurt from his voice since her caution was clearly born from painful experience. I hoped you wouldn't, Lyra replied, meeting his eyes with the kind of steady gaze that seemed far too mature for someone her age. But hope and certainty are different things, and I have learned that trust is a luxury that exiled princesses cannot afford. The weight of her situation settled over Ben, like a heavy blanket, as he realized that his simple act of kindness had entangled him in galactic politics of the most dangerous variety. So what happens now, he asked, knowing that everything had changed between them. even though his determination to protect her remained stronger than ever. Lyra's hand moved unconsciously to the royal biomark on her wrist, the intricate design pulsing with soft light as though responding to her emotional state. "Now you know why I can never stop running," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had already traveled farther and seen more than most beings experience in a lifetime. "The Iron Syndicate has long reach and patient hunters. They will never stop searching until they find me." Dawn was breaking over New Chicago's industrial district when the first Earth security transport touched down at the hub's emergency landing pad, its sleek black hull reflecting the orange glow of sunrise while disgorging a squad of heavily armed soldiers who moved with the kind of disciplined precision that suggested serious trouble. Ben watched from the observation window in Section C4 as Commander Hayes stepped from the lead vehicle, his imposing figure immediately recognizable from the security briefings that all hub personnel were required to attend. Monthly Hayes had built his reputation on being absolutely relentless when pursuing targets, and the fact that he'd personally come to oversee what should have been a routine search meant that whoever they were hunting was considered extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. "All maintenance staff report to central processing for mandatory security screening," the announcement crackled through the hub's communication system, Hayes's authoritative voice carrying undertones that suggested non-compliance would not be tolerated. Ben felt his stomach clench with sudden fear as he realized that his weeks of secret visits to Section D7 might have been noticed despite his careful precautions, and if the security scanners detected any unusual biosignatures on his clothing or equipment, explanations would become extremely difficult. Moving as casually as possible through the corridors while other workers hurried toward the central processing area, Ben made a slight detour that took him past the abandoned storage room where Lyra had been sheltering. "We need to leave immediately," he whispered urgently as he slipped inside, finding her already awake and apparently aware that something had changed in the hub's normally predictable routine. Lyra's violet eyes were wide with the kind of alert tension he'd learned to associate with her survival instincts, and she was already gathering the few possessions she'd accumulated during her stay. "The Iron Syndicate?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Earth security, but they're looking for dangerous alien fugitives according to their announcement," Ben replied, helping her stuff emergency supplies into the small pack he'd provided weeks earlier. "Which means the Syndicate has convinced your government that I'm a terrorist rather than a refugee," Lyra said with bitter understanding, her hands moving swiftly to secure the royal biomark on her wrist beneath makeshift bandages. "They're very skilled at manipulating official narratives." Ben could hear boots echoing through distant corridors as Hayes's soldiers began their systematic search of the facility, and he knew they had perhaps minutes before the sweep reached their section. "There's a maintenance tunnel system that connects to the old subway infrastructure beneath the city," he said, pulling out his portable scanner to check for clear routes. "If we can reach the Undercity before they seal the exits, we might have a chance." Lyra shouldered her pack with practiced efficiency, her movements already displaying the fluid grace he'd noticed from their first meeting, but now understood as formal training rather than natural ability. "Ben," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm with one small hand. "You don't have to do this. Helping me escape will make you a fugitive as well, and I won't think less of you if you choose to walk away." Looking down at her upturned face, Ben saw not the frightened child who'd been scavenging in dumpsters 3 weeks ago, but the future queen of an entire star system, someone whose survival might determine the fate of billions of beings across the Outer Rim territories. "Princess or not," he said firmly, making a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "No one deserves to be hunted like an animal, especially not someone who's already lost everything." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the electronic beeping of scanning equipment and the crisp commands of soldiers conducting room-by-room searches. Ben led Lyra through a series of service corridors he'd memorized during his years working the night shift, using his maintenance access codes to open secured doorways that would hopefully delay pursuit long enough for them to reach the tunnel system. "Stop right there," a voice shouted from behind them as they reached the entrance to the old subway maintenance shaft, the beam of a high-powered flashlight suddenly illuminating their position. Ben spun around to see a Earth security trooper raising his weapon, The soldier's face hidden behind tactical gear, but his intent clearly hostile. "She's just a child," Ben said, stepping protectively in front of Lyra while raising his hands in what he hoped would be interpreted as a non-threatening gesture. "That child is wanted for questioning in connection with terrorist activities," the soldier replied, his weapon remaining trained on them both. "Step away from the suspect and place your hands on the wall." Ben felt Lyra's small hand slip into his, her fingers surprisingly steady despite the obvious danger they faced. "Run," she whispered so quietly that only he could hear. "When I create a distraction, use the maintenance shaft and don't look back." Before Ben could ask what she meant, the royal biomark on Lyra's wrist began to glow with sudden intensity, the intricate pattern flaring bright enough to cast shadows on the tunnel walls. The Earth security trooper stumbled backward with a startled curse as the light intensified beyond what should have been possible from such a small device. His weapons, targeting systems apparently disrupted by some form of electromagnetic interference. "Move," Lyra shouted, pulling Ben toward the maintenance shaft as alarms began blaring throughout the facility, and additional soldiers could be heard converging on their position. They dropped through the access tunnel into darkness that smelled of rust and decades of abandonment, landing on a narrow maintenance platform that connected to the old subway system's forgotten infrastructure. "What was that thing on your wrist?" Ben gasped as they began moving through tunnels that hadn't seen regular use since the city's transportation grid had been upgraded decades earlier. "A royal biomark doesn't just identify members of the ruling family," Lyra explained while navigating the maze of abandoned passages with surprising confidence. "It's also a defensive system designed to protect us in exactly this kind of situation." Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer as Hayes's soldiers apparently located the maintenance shaft and began their descent into the Undercity. "The biomark responds to stress and threat levels," Lyra continued, her violet eyes seeming to glow faintly in the dim light filtering through ventilation grates. "The stronger the danger, the more powerful its defensive capabilities become." Ben followed her through a series of interconnected tunnels that eventually opened into a vast underground chamber that had once served as a central hub for the old subway system, now home to a community of people who existed on the margins of official society. "Welcome to the Undercity," Lyra said softly, gesturing toward the makeshift dwellings and small businesses that had taken root in the abandoned infrastructure. "Where those who don't fit into official categories come to disappear." Looking around at the diverse collection of humans and aliens who had made lives for themselves in this forgotten space, Ben realized that their flight from Hayes and his soldiers was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous journey. "They'll never stop hunting for you, will they?" he asked, watching as Lyra's biomark gradually dimmed to its normal level of subtle luminescence. "Not as long as I represent a legitimate claim to the Etherean throne," she replied, her young face showing the kind of weary determination that spoke of burdens no child should have to carry. "Then maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting back," Ben said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice as he looked around at the Undercity's inhabitants. "Because something tells me you're not the only one down here who's been forced to hide from the Iron Syndicate and their supporters." In the distance, the echo of approaching boots suggested that Commander Hayes and his soldiers had finally navigated the tunnel system, and Ben knew that their brief respite in the Undercity was about to come to an end. But as he watched Lyra straighten her shoulders and lift her chin with the kind of quiet dignity that proclaimed her royal heritage despite her tattered clothing, Ben realized that they were no longer simply running from their pursuers. They were beginning to gather the allies and resources necessary to take the fight directly to those who had destroyed her family and stolen her birthright, starting with the diverse community of outcasts and refugees who called the Undercity home. Captain Rosa Martinez had seen enough in her 20 years of running cargo between star systems to recognize desperation when it walked into her improvised office in the depths of New Chicago's abandoned subway network. But the combination of a maintenance worker and what appeared to be a young alien refugee still managed to surprise her. Ben stood awkwardly beside a small figure whose violet eyes seemed to catalog every detail of the cramped space that Rosa had converted from an old ticket booth, complete with communication equipment that definitely wasn't supposed to exist in the Undercity. "Danny Fletcher said you might be able to help us," Ben began, referring to the scrap dealer who served as an unofficial mayor of the underground community. "We need passage off-world quietly and without questions." Rosa leaned back in her salvaged office chair, studying the unlikely pair with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read people's stories in their posture and expressions. The maintenance worker was clearly out of his depth, but determined to protect his young companion, while the girl possessed the kind of natural poise that suggested she was far more than she appeared. Off-world passage isn't cheap, and it's gotten a lot more dangerous since Earth security started cracking down on unauthorized passenger manifests, Rosa said, testing their commitment while observing their reactions. "We can pay." Lyra spoke for the first time, her voice carrying musical undertones that marked her as definitely not human. "And we understand the risks involved." Something about the child's tone made Rosa look more closely, noting details that began forming a disturbing pattern. The quality of bone structure visible despite obvious malnourishment, the way she held herself like someone accustomed to being listened to, and most significantly the careful bandages wrapped around her left wrist. "What exactly are you two running from?" Rosa asked bluntly, having learned that direct questions often revealed more than careful diplomatic inquiries. Ben glanced at Lyra, clearly waiting for her to decide how much truth to share with this potentially crucial ally. "The Iron Syndicate wants me dead," Lyra said simply, unwrapping the bandages to reveal the unmistakable glow of a royal biomark. "Because as long as I live, their conquest of Etheria Prime remains illegitimate." Rosa's chair creaked as she sat forward suddenly, her expression shifting from mild interest to intense concern as she recognized the implications of what she was seeing. "Sweet mother of stars," she whispered. "You're Princess Lyreley. We've been looking for you for months." Ben tensed, ready to grab Lyra and run if this unexpected recognition proved to be another threat. But Rosa's next words stopped him cold. "I served in the Etherian Royal Guard before I started running cargo," she continued, pulling off a worn necklace to reveal a small pendant bearing the same flowing design as Lyra's biomark. "Your father commissioned me to find you after the palace fell." The reunion that followed was unlike anything Ben had expected, as Rosa knelt before Lyra with tears streaming down her weathered face, while the young princess maintained the kind of dignified composure that spoke of formal training in dealing with emotional situations. "Captain Martinez," Lyra said formally, though her voice carried warmth that hadn't been present when she'd spoken to Ben or anyone else in the Undercity. "I had hoped some of my father's people survived the attack." "Not many," Rosa replied grimly, rising to her feet and moving to activate the hidden communication equipment that connected her to other members of what Ben was beginning to realize was a much larger organization. The Syndicate was very thorough in eliminating anyone who might rally resistance to their occupation, but they underestimated how many of us had connections beyond Etherian space. Over the next several hours, Ben watched in amazement as Rosa contacted what she called the Network, a loosely organized collection of smugglers, former military personnel, and idealistic civilians who had been quietly helping refugees escape persecution across multiple star systems. "It's like the old Underground Railroad that helped slaves escape in ancient Earth history," Rosa explained as messages flowed back and forth between hidden bases scattered throughout the galaxy. "Except instead of moving people between countries, we're moving them between entire star systems." The communication revealed information that made Ben's head spin with its scope and complexity. Safe houses on a dozen different worlds, sympathetic officials in various governmental organizations, and most surprisingly, resistance cells that had been forming throughout Iron Syndicate territory. "Your disappearance has become a symbol," Rosa told Lyra as reports continued flowing in from across known space. "Every world the Syndicate has conquered, every population they've oppressed, people tell stories about the lost princess who will return to restore justice." Lyra listened to these accounts with growing amazement, her biomark pulsing with increasingly bright light as her emotional state intensified. "I never intended to become a symbol," she said quietly. "I only wanted to survive long enough to honor my family's memory. Sometimes we don't get to choose what we become," Rosa replied, beginning to outline escape routes and potential destinations. But we can choose what we do, with the opportunities fate provides. As plans took shape for smuggling Lyra off Earth aboard Rosa's cargo vessel, Ben noticed something that would later prove significant. The princess had begun displaying abilities that went beyond the simple defensive capabilities of her royal biomark. During particularly emotional moments in their planning sessions, other aliens in the Undercity would pause whatever they were doing and turn toward their location, as though responding to some form of communication that humans couldn't detect. "What's happening to her?" Ben asked Rosa during a brief private moment when Lyra was resting. "Bridgewalker abilities," Rosa replied with a mixture of awe and concern. "The royal bloodline of Etheria has always produced individuals capable of forming empathic connections across species barriers, but it usually doesn't manifest until adulthood. The stress of losing her family and being hunted has apparently accelerated the process," she continued, watching as several alien refugees gathered around Lyra's sleeping form like protective guardians. "She's unconsciously reaching out to other beings who understand loss and displacement." Their planning session was interrupted by urgent alerts from Rosa's communication network. Iron Syndicate bounty hunters had been detected entering Earth's solar system, apparently having tracked some trace of Lyra's presence to New Chicago. "They move fast," Rosa muttered, rapidly sending coded messages to abort several planned operations. "But they're not the only ones with resources and determination." The attack came 3 days later. Just as Rosa's ship was being loaded with supplies for their escape voyage, Ben was helping Lyra gather her few possessions when the first explosion shook the Undercity, followed immediately by the distinctive whine of energy weapons and shouted commands in multiple languages. "Syndicate assault teams," Rosa confirmed grimly as she armed herself with military-grade weapons that definitely shouldn't have been available to civilian cargo captains. "They've found us." The battle that followed raged through the abandoned subway tunnels as the Undercity's inhabitants proved far better organized and more heavily armed than their attackers had expected. Ben found himself pressed into service as a communications runner, carrying messages between defensive positions, while Lyra demonstrated abilities that left him speechless with amazement. During the fiercest fighting, when Syndicate soldiers had nearly broken through the main defensive line, Lyra's biomark flared with brilliant light as she reached out through her growing Bridgewalker powers to coordinate the defenders. Every alien in the Undercity suddenly moved with perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's actions and covering weaknesses with an efficiency that turned the tide of battle. "She's connecting them all," Rosa shouted over the noise of combat, her face showing wonder despite the dangerous situation. "Creating a temporary psychic network that lets them fight as a unified force." When the smoke finally cleared, and the surviving Syndicate troops had retreated, Ben realized that everything had changed once again. Lyra was no longer just a refugee princess they were trying to smuggle to safety. She was becoming something unprecedented, a Bridgewalker whose abilities might be capable of uniting the scattered resistance movements into a force capable of challenging the Iron Syndicate's expanding empire. "The network wants to know," Rosa said as she compiled damage reports and casualty lists. "Are we still planning to hide you somewhere safe, or are you ready to take the fight back to those who destroyed your world?" Lyra stood among the defenders who had risked their lives to protect her, her violet eyes reflecting a determination that seemed far older than her apparent age. "I've been running long enough," she said, her biomark pulsing with steady light that somehow conveyed absolute resolve. "It's time to remind the galaxy what happens when you threaten those under the protection of Etheria's crown." 6 months after the battle in New Chicago's Undercity, the resistance network had grown from a scattered collection of smugglers and refugees into something approaching a legitimate military force, with Princess Lyra serving as both its symbolic leader and its most powerful strategic asset. Ben stood on the observation deck of the converted cargo hauler Starweaver, watching dozens of ships maneuver in the asteroid field that served as their mobile base. Vessels ranging from sleek military corvettes crewed by former Etherian Guard members to massive freight haulers filled with supplies and volunteer fighters. "Hard to believe it all started with a scared little girl eating scraps behind a dumpster," he said to Rosa, who had become the unofficial admiral of their improvised fleet. "That scared little girl has been busy," Rosa replied, indicating the tactical displays that showed the extent of their growing rebellion. Resistance cells on 47. World's 3 liberated systems and Iron Syndicate supply lines disrupted across half the Outer Rim territories. The transformation in Lyra herself had been even more dramatic than the growth of their military capabilities. The malnourished refugee Ben had first sheltered had developed into a young woman whose bridgewalker abilities now allowed her to maintain psychic contact with resistance leaders across vast distances of space. Her royal biomark had evolved as well, the simple wrist tattoo expanding into an intricate network of flowing patterns that covered much of her left arm and pulsed with increasing brightness as her powers grew stronger. "Where is she now?" Ben asked, noting the empty command chair that Lyra normally occupied during fleet operations. "In her quarters, coordinating simultaneous strikes on Syndicate installations in the Vega sector," Rosa replied with a mixture of pride and concern. "She's been maintaining contact with 7 different resistance cells for the past 18 hours. Ben frowned, knowing from experience that extended use of her bridgewalker abilities left Lyra physically and emotionally drained. "The medics keep warning her about overextending herself," he said, "but she won't listen to anyone when there are people counting on her." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent alerts from the fleet's communication center as long-range scanners detected an approaching vessel broadcasting Iron Syndicate. "Identification codes, single heavy cruiser," the tactical officer reported, "but it's not moving in an attack pattern. Looks like they want to talk." The ship that docked with their command vessel carried an unexpected passenger, General Marcus Webb of Earth Defense Forces, a man whose reputation for integrity had made him one of the few human military leaders trusted by alien governments. "Princess Lyrelei," Webb said formally, as he was escorted to the fleet's main conference room, where Lyra waited with her senior advisors. "I come bearing an offer from the Galactic Security Council." Lyra studied the general with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim lighting, her expanded biomark patterns shifting slowly, as she apparently used her bridgewalker abilities to assess his emotional state and intentions. "The Council has finally decided to acknowledge what the Iron Syndicate really is?" she asked with carefully controlled diplomatic courtesy. "3 systems have formally requested intervention," Webb replied, activating a holographic display that showed the current state of Syndicate-controlled territory. "The evidence of genocide and forced labor camps has become impossible to ignore. And they want us to stop fighting so they can handle the situation through proper diplomatic channels," Lyra said, with the kind of weary understanding that suggested she'd heard similar offers before. "Actually," Webb said, his expression suggesting he was about to deliver unexpected news. "They want to officially recognize your claim to the Etherian throne and provide military support for a coordinated liberation campaign." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of ship systems and the distant sounds of fleet activity. "What's the catch?" Rosa asked bluntly, her experience with official promises making her suspicious of any offer that seemed too good to be true. "No catch," Webb replied, "but there are conditions. The liberation must be conducted according to interstellar law, with minimal civilian casualties and respect for prisoners of war." Ben watched Lyra's face as she considered the offer, noting the way her biomark pattern seemed to pulse in rhythm with her thoughts. "They're afraid," she said finally, her bridgewalker abilities apparently providing insights that normal diplomatic analysis couldn't detect. "The Syndicate has grown, too powerful, and the Council realizes they waited too long to act." "The offer is genuine," Webb confirmed, "but there's also urgency. Our intelligence suggests the Syndicate is preparing something called Final Solution Protocol for the remaining free systems in their territory." Lyra's biomark flared suddenly bright as her emotional control slipped, and every alien within 100 meters of their location paused whatever they were doing as her distress rippled through their psychic connection. "Mass extermination," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of barely contained horror. "They're planning to eliminate entire populations rather than risk further rebellion. How long do we have?" Rosa asked, already beginning mental calculations of fleet readiness and supply requirements. 6 weeks, possibly less," Webb replied grimly. "The Syndicate has been moving unusual equipment into the targeted systems, the kind of machinery used for atmospheric processing and population control. Ben felt his stomach clench as he realized they were no longer planning a gradual liberation campaign, but a desperate rescue mission, with billions of lives hanging in the balance. "We'll need every ship, every fighter, every resistance cell," Lyra said, rising from her chair with the kind of determination that had characterized her transformation from refugee to rebel leader. "This isn't about reclaiming my throne anymore. It's about preventing the largest genocide in galactic history." Over the following days, Ben watched in amazement as Lyra used her bridgewalker abilities to coordinate the largest military operation in recent galactic history. Messages flowed through her psychic network to resistance cells across dozens of star systems, while formal, diplomatic channels carried General Webb's requests for support from every government willing to oppose the Iron Syndicate's expansion. The fleet that gradually assembled in the hidden asteroid base represented an unprecedented alliance. Etherian guard ships flying alongside Earth defense vessels, alien species that had been enemies for centuries working together under Lyra's unifying influence. "She's doing something that was supposed to be impossible," Rosa observed, as they watched ships from 20 different species conducting joint training exercises, creating genuine cooperation between beings who've never trusted each other. Ben nodded, remembering the frightened child who had hidden from security patrols just months earlier. "The question is whether her abilities are strong enough to hold everything together during actual combat," he said, watching as Lyra stood on the command deck surrounded by holographic displays showing fleet positions across multiple star systems. The answer came sooner than expected when long-range scouts reported that the Iron Syndicate had accelerated their timeline. "Final solution protocol has been activated," the intelligence officer announced with barely controlled panic. "Atmospheric poisoning has begun on 12 worlds in the Centauri cluster." Lyra's biomark blazed with brilliant light as she opened her psychic network to its maximum extent, her consciousness reaching across space to coordinate the massive fleet, now moving toward what would become known as the Battle of Etheria Prime. "This is it," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that somehow reached every being in the Allied fleet simultaneously. "Today we find out whether the galaxy belongs to those who build bridges or those who burn them." As the Star Weaver jumped to hyperspace along with hundreds of other vessels, Ben realized that the maintenance worker who had once helped a hungry alien child was now part of something that would either save billions of lives or witness the greatest military disaster in recorded history. But looking at Lyra as she stood at the center of her expanding psychic network, coordinating fleet movements with the kind of strategic brilliance that seemed to transcend normal military planning, Ben felt something he hadn't experienced since this all began. Hope that they might actually succeed in stopping the Iron Syndicate before it was too late. The space above Etheria Prime had become a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams, with the debris of Iron Syndicate warships drifting alongside the wreckage of resistance vessels in a macabre dance that spoke of the terrible cost of liberation. Ben stood in the auxiliary command center of the Star Weaver, watching through reinforced viewports as the final phase of the battle unfolded, not with weapons and explosions but with something far more powerful and unprecedented. Princess Lyra floated in the center of the command deck's holographic array. Her consciousness expanded through her bridgewalker abilities to encompass every sentient being within 3 star systems, her royal biomark patterns now covering most of her body in flowing designs that pulsed with colors beyond normal human perception. "She's connected to everyone," General Webb whispered in amazement as his tactical displays showed Iron Syndicate forces across the planet, laying down their weapons in response to something they were receiving through the psychic network. Soldiers, civilians, even the command structure. They're all experiencing her memories directly. The battle had raged for 6 days as the Allied fleet fought desperately to prevent the final solution protocol from completing its horrific work. 12 worlds had already fallen silent before they arrived, their atmospheres poisoned beyond recovery. But the main Syndicate fleet had made their stand at Etheria Prime in a final attempt to eliminate the resistance, once and for all. Traditional military tactics had proven insufficient against the Syndicate's superior numbers and fortified positions, leaving the Allied forces on the verge of defeat when Lyra made the decision that would transform not just this battle, but the future of galactic civilization. Instead of coordinating military strikes through her psychic network, she had opened her consciousness completely, sharing her memories and emotions with every being capable of receiving them. What exactly are they experiencing? Rosa asked as she monitored the communications channels that were now filled with confused reports from Syndicate commanders whose troops were refusing orders. Everything, Lyra replied, though her voice seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the command deck. They're seeing what I saw when my family died, feeling what it's like to lose everything you love, understanding what it means to watch innocent people suffer for someone else's ambition. The effect was unlike anything in recorded military history. Iron Syndicate soldiers who had spent years following orders without question were suddenly experiencing the memories of their victims, the fear of children during orbital bombardments, the despair of families separated by forced relocations, the agony of watching loved ones die from atmospheric poisoning. Command units are reporting mass desertions, Webb's intelligence officer announced as data flowed in from across the planet. Entire battalions are abandoning their positions and moving toward refugee camps to provide aid. But the true transformation was happening on a deeper level as Lyra's Bridgewalker abilities created connections between beings who had never understood each other before. Human soldiers found themselves experiencing the world through alien senses, while alien fighters gained insight into human emotions and motivations that had previously been incomprehensible. She's not just showing them what the Syndicate has done, Ben realized as he watched the patterns of light flowing through Lyra's expanded biomark network. She's teaching them what it means to truly understand someone different from yourself. The moment that would later be remembered as the turning point came when Admiral Kane, the Iron Syndicate's supreme commander, made direct contact with the Allied fleet Princess Lirelai. His voice carried none of the arrogant authority that had characterized Syndicate communications. I surrender my forces unconditionally and request permission to assist in humanitarian operations. Kane's transformation was the most dramatic. Of all, the man who had orchestrated the genocide of 3 star systems was now weeping openly as he experienced the full emotional impact of his actions through the psychic connection. The network is showing him everything, Lyra explained, her consciousness somehow maintaining multiple conversations while coordinating relief efforts across dozens of worlds. Not just the deaths he caused, but the lives that could have been lived, the discoveries that will never be made, the love that was lost forever. The surrender of the Iron Syndicate marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Great Reconciliation, as Lyra's Bridgewalker abilities continued to facilitate understanding between former enemies. The various species that had been manipulated into conflict began working together with unprecedented cooperation. The Galactic Security Council wants to know about your intentions, General Webb informed Lyra as the last Syndicate stronghold surrendered without violence. There's significant support for recognizing your claim to the Etherian throne. Lyra's consciousness gradually returned to normal awareness as the immediate crisis passed, though the psychic connections she had forged remained active at a lower level. The throne was never what this was about, she said, looking out at the fleet of ships representing dozens of different species now working together to provide aid to the liberated worlds. But if accepting it means I can prevent this kind of tragedy from happening again, then I accept. The coronation ceremony that took place 6 months later was unlike any in galactic history. Representatives from every known species gathered on the restored Etheria Prime to witness not just the crowning of a new queen, but the inauguration of the first galactic Bridgewalker, Your Majesty, the ceremony's master of protocol announced as Lyra accepted the ancient crown of her ancestors. How do you wish to be known to the galaxy? As Queen Lyra, first Bridgewalker and protector of all who seek understanding across the barriers that divide us, she replied, her biomark patterns now permanently visible as flowing designs that seemed to shift between the artistic styles of dozens of different cultures. Ben watched from his place among the honored guests, remembering the frightened child who had been eating scraps behind a dumpster less than 2 years earlier. Royal Advisor Ben Carter, Lyra said, using her official voice but letting her eyes show the warmth and affection that protocol didn't allow her to express publicly. "Please step forward." As Ben approached the throne, he could feel the subtle psychic connection that now linked him permanently to Lyra, and through her to the growing network of beings who shared her vision of genuine galactic unity. "The first Bridgewalker cannot govern alone," Lyra announced. "To the assembled delegates, I hereby appoint Ben Carter as prime advisor and keeper of the common touch, to ensure that the voice of ordinary people is never forgotten in the councils of power." The appointment was more than ceremonial. Ben's unique perspective as someone who had seen Lyra's transformation from the beginning made him invaluable in helping other species understand what Bridgewalker abilities could accomplish. "So what happens now?" he asked during a private moment after the ceremony, when they could speak as friends rather than queen and advisor. "Now we build something that's never existed before," Lyra replied, gesturing toward the holographic displays that showed the network of psychic connections now linking millions of beings across hundreds of worlds. A civilization based on genuine understanding rather than fear and prejudice. The months that followed proved that the transformation was real and lasting. Trade disputes that might once have led to wars were resolved through Bridgewalker mediation, while joint scientific projects produced discoveries that no single species could have achieved alone. "The network keeps growing," Rosa reported during one of their regular planning sessions. "We're getting requests for Bridgewalker training from species that haven't had contact with the galactic community for centuries." Ben smiled, remembering how all of this had started with a simple decision to help someone who needed assistance. "Sometimes, the most important changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness," he said, watching as Lyra worked with a group of young aliens who were developing their own Bridgewalker abilities. "And sometimes," Lyra added, her consciousness briefly touching his through their permanent psychic link, "the universe conspires to put the right people in the right place at exactly the right time." As the sun set over the restored capital of Etheria Prime, Ben reflected on how his life as a maintenance worker had led him to become advisor to the most powerful ruler in galactic history, but more importantly, he had learned that true power didn't come from armies or technology or political authority. It came from the simple recognition that every being in the universe, no matter how different or seemingly insignificant, possessed inherent worth and dignity. The little alien girl he had found eating leftovers had taught him that lesson, and in return, she had helped create a galaxy where such understanding might finally become the foundation of lasting peace. Looking up at the stars that now seemed closer and more welcoming than ever before, Ben knew that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them.